Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Elisabeth Türk. I'm the director of UNECE's Economic Cooperation and Trade Division, and it's my great pleasure today to moderate this webinar on the theme Harnessing E-commerce post-Covid-19, Opportunities and Challenges for Transition Economies. COVID-19 has demonstrated the special role e-commerce can play during the crisis and beyond. Today, in times of lockdown, digital technologies are offering an alternative challenge for maintaining business activities, for maintaining social interactions, and also consumption. In Europe, digital adoption jumped from 80 to 95% as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. That's a rise that would have taken 2 to 3 years in most industries at pre-pandemic growth rates. While COVID-19 was an opportunity for many digital-driven businesses, the pandemic also reinforced pre-existing bottlenecks. If we want to achieve inclusive e-commerce development, addressing such bottlenecks is needed today more than ever. And international cooperation, including the work of the United Nations, UNCTAD, for example, and the United Nations Regional Economic Commissions, as well as the World Trade Organization, offers opportunities here. And these are the challenges and opportunities we will be discussing in our webinar today. Ladies and gentlemen, this event is the fourth in a series of webinars UNECE is hosting jointly with the Geneva Trade Platform, GTP. And these events are of a purely informal nature. They are aimed at outreach and engagement with stakeholders, particularly stakeholders in UNECE's 17 program countries. These are countries in Central Asia, Southern Caucasus, Western Balkan, and Eastern Europe. This also includes a set of Russian-speaking countries, and that's why I'm very glad that we can offer English-Russian interpretation. In doing so, we aim to better reach policymakers and relevant stakeholders in the capitals in countries with economies in transition. Should you have missed one of our prior events, you can see the recordings at the UNECE and GTP web pages. And here I would really like to extend our immense gratitude to the Geneva Trade Platform, GTP, for joining hands with UNECE in this important effort. As I noted, these informal webinars are informal, they are not part of UNECE's intergovernmental machinery, but they are of course closely related to the different work streams of UNECE. And as one example of these linkages, let me draw your attention to UNECE's forthcoming Regional Forum on Sustainable Development that's scheduled for mid-March. And the Regional Forum is something close to a flagship event for UNECE. And as part of that forum, we will also have a joint session with ITU on digital transformation for the Sustainable Development Goals. Staying with the linkages to UNECE work streams, this effort to ensure these linkages makes us take a very specific angle to discussing e-commerce today. And let me flag this angle in 3 dimensions. First, today we will look at e-commerce in the connection with UNECE's work on trade facilitation and as an enabler for sustainable trade. E-commerce is intrinsically linked with trade facilitation. There are a host of joint issues, such as the need for cutting red tape in goods traded through e-commerce. E-commerce is also very much linked with sustainable trade. That's another priority for UNECE. Improving access to ICT and addressing the capacity gaps for SMEs, for women is crucial. And all of this plays out in UNECE's regular involvement in the United Nations Global Survey on Digital and Sustainable Trade Facilitation, which is currently ongoing and which I hope distinguished audience and experts in capital that you're all responding to in great numbers. Now, the second linkage is a linkage on a specific project, and today's event really provides an opportunity to discuss preliminary findings of a study that UNECE has commissioned with UNCTAD support as part of the UN's broader post-COVID initiative. And this is an activity also together with other regional economic commissions of the UN. And we are very glad to have with us today Mr. Torbjørn Fredriksson, who is chief of the ICT policy section in UNCTAD. And that's the team guiding this aspect of the UN's COVID response. And Ms. Hadil Hijazi, director at WTO Advisors, who is currently finalizing this study. And I would like to thank all colleagues who have contributed to the study in their various capacities. And importantly, that also includes Ms. Dipali Fernandez, one of the authors of the report. Now, the third linkage is the country focus. And as with earlier events in this series, today's webinar makes a specific effort to look at our topic from the perspective of countries with economies in transition. And we reflect this also through our speakers, and I'm delighted to have with us Mr. Maxim Medvedkov from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. And I'm also delighted to have with us Mr. Vitaly Pagaritsky, who is a counsel at the Advisory Law Center on WTO Law in Geneva. Before we dive into the presentations, let me take this opportunity to recap a few housekeeping remarks. So first of all, as I've mentioned, the event is being recorded and we will make it available to the public on our website and through the YouTube channel of the Geneva Trade Platform. Second, as mentioned before, I'm pleased that we are able to provide English-Russian translation. So in order to access the translation, you can either download the Interaktio app or you can access the web app from your browser. Once you are there, you need to enter the event code, that's TRADE21, and then you select the channel you wish to use. All these instructions for how to access the interpretation, you're also finding them in the chat box, so you can go there and have a look. The third housekeeping remark relates to our audience. Please note that the audience is muted and the audience cannot be seen. And I'm very pleased that this morning we realized that we have reached some 130 registrations. So thank you to everybody who is joining us today. In UNECE transition economies, the pandemic has resulted in real spikes in the B2C and B2C e-commerce transactions. And that can be seen from a recently released UNCTAD B2C e-commerce index 2020. And Belarus and the Russian Federation are amongst the top countries there, so congratulations. The pandemic, however, has also exposed pre-existing challenges, and these are challenges that are faced by aspiring e-commerce entrepreneurs. That's occurring around the globe, and transition economies in the UNECE region are not spared, and they are also affected by these challenges. So these are challenges, for example, relating to regulatory differences, such as access to online payment solutions, challenges related to reliable internet and electricity connections, the prohibitive cost of trading across borders, or also visibility in online searches and advertising and sales platforms. So the pandemic has stressed the crucial importance to bridge the digital divide. And that's also within countries and between countries. And COVID-19 has exposed the need to address questions about, for example, the extent to which small producers, small sellers can benefit from the opportunities that e-commerce provides. These are all very important challenges, and this last week of February in 2021, where we are about 1 year into the COVID pandemic, is very timely to discuss these challenges. It's also timely because when looking at the World Trade Organization, earlier in February, the WTO reported progress on certain e-commerce negotiations. And when looking at UNCTAD, UNCTAD just this very week released its business-to-consumer e-commerce index. So basically, we have a product that is sort of hot off the press here. And that brings me to our amazing lineup of speakers. What will we do? We will first hear from two highly reputed advisory organizations in Geneva, one more on the legal side and one more on the trade policy, economic side. Delighted to have with us Ms. Hadil Hijazi Director at WTI Advisors, and Mr. Vitaly Pagaritse, Counsel at the Advisory Law Center for WTO Law. Today is an opportunity for us to also learn what services these two Geneva-based organizations, WTI Advisors and ACWL, are offering. Then we are delighted to have two commentators, one from the international perspective. Very glad to have with us Mr. Torbjörn Fredriksson from UNCTAD, and one from the national perspective. Very delighted to have with us Mr. Maxim Medvedkov from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. And Mr. Medvedkov was also a trade negotiator and was very instrumental in making the Russian Federation join the WTO. Let me now at this point ask all four of our guests to say a few words about who they are, which organization they represent, and yes, also what made you join our event and why do you think our discussion is interesting? Let us start with Hadil. Hadil, the floor is yours for a brief introduction.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for having me here today and for this very friendly introduction. My name, as correctly pronounced by Elizabeth, is Hadil Hijazi. I'm a director of WTI Advisors. WTI Advisors is a boutique advisory consultancy based in Geneva since 2005. And we advise governments, international organizations, businesses on trade law, trade policy, and trade economics. This is a very brief introduction. Maybe I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Hadil. It's great to have you with us today, and we look forward to your presentation in a moment. Next, we have Mr. Vitaly Pagaritse. Welcome, Vitaly. The floor is yours for a brief introduction.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. First of all, I'm very delighted to speak at this very interesting event and with such distinguished speakers. Just a few words about the ACWL, where I work as counsel. The ACWL is an intergovernmental organization based in Geneva. It sees developing country members of the WTO and the least developed countries, LDCs, on all matters of WTO law. Our mandate includes legal advice to these countries, for example, on the current negotiations of e-commerce and many other issues, representing these countries in WTO disputes, and also training for government officials both in capitals and in Geneva. We have recently started cooperating with several WTO members from Eastern Europe and Central Asia, who I understand are also very active members of the UNSC. So, for example, Kazakhstan has joined us in 2020, and Ukraine is now finalizing its accession process. Also, as a responsible civil servant, I would like to mention upfront that everything I say here is my personal opinion and shouldn't be attributed to the ACWL. On this floor, I pass the floor back to you, Elizabeth, and I really look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Vitaly. Thank you for this introduction, and I'm sure we'll all benefit from the legal expertise you're bringing. Next, we have Mr. Torbjörn Fredriksson from UNCTAD. Welcome, Torbjörn. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and hello to everyone. It's a great pleasure to participate in this webinar. So my name is Torbjörn Fredriksson, and I'm leading UNCTAD's work on e-commerce and the digital economy. I have now been with UNCTAD for 21 years, so I'm part of the furniture, and I've been responsible for the work on the digital economy since 2008. In this area, we do research such as the Digital Economy Report and the B2C e-commerce index that was referred to by Elizabeth. We also provide forums for global dialogue in the form of the UNCTAD e-commerce week, which this year is scheduled to take place in Abu Dhabi in October, if the pandemic so allows. We also have an intergovernmental group of experts that focuses entirely on e-commerce and the digital economy. Finally, we offer various kinds of technical assistance and capacity building to member states. We can assess the readiness of countries to engage in e-commerce and also to develop national strategies in this area. We also help improve the measurement of the digital economy, as well as the legal and regulatory frameworks for more inclusive e-commerce. In addition, since 2016, we lead what we call the E-Trade for All initiative, which now has 32 institutional partners, including the UNECE and the other regional commissions of the UN. And this initiative seeks to make it easier for member states to find partners that can help and provide assistance to deal with current weaknesses in their readiness to engage in e-commerce and the digital economy. And it also seeks to reduce the risk of duplication among the various international players, because there's a lot of players out there that are doing various things that are relevant for e-commerce, but there's always the risk of duplication instead of finding synergies. So from that perspective, I'm really delighted that we can work together with UNECE also in the context of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Torbjörn, for that and for shedding light on the breadth of activities on e-commerce that is happening in UNCTAD. And I'm also very happy that from the UNECE side, we can contribute a little bit to these initiatives. Now, we also have with us Mr. Maxim Medvedkov. Welcome, Maxim. We were delighted to have had you already as a speaker at one of our earlier webinars, and that was a webinar when we looked at trade and investment data. And we very much enjoyed the expertise and you brought there. Mr. Medvedkov, the floor is yours for an introduction.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'm working with one of the biggest Russian university high school of economics, a big trade facility there, responsible for education of people, future trade negotiators. Not only for Russia, we have students from 6 countries currently, other than Russian. And we have also a rather big research facility on trade policy within as well. We are co-founders of a Center for W Expertise, which is a non-profit organization helping to governments, first of all, Russian government, but also others on different issues, including dispute settlement in the WTO and preparation for trade negotiations, including on e-commerce. So that explains why I'm so pleased to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxim, for that and for also giving us a glimpse of what is being offered in Moscow, both on the negotiating side and also on the dispute settlement side. Let us move to the second part of our webinar. Let us proceed to the 2 kickoff presentations. And as mentioned before, we'll start with Ms. Hadil Hijazi from WTI Advisors to talk a little bit about the recent UNECE UNCTAD study. Hadil, we are curious to see and to hear from you. The floor is yours. And you have to unmute yourself.
I realize that. Thank you, Elizabeth, once again for inviting me to participate in this very interesting discussion. A few months ago, UNCE asked us to participate in contributing to an ongoing study on harnessing the opportunities of e-commerce in the UNECE countries, specifically the economies in transition. And we found, of course, the topic extremely topical and very important. It touches upon 2 major developments and themes. One is, of course, e-commerce and the importance of that subject. And the other one is the pandemic. So we're very happy to be part of the contribution to the study. The study focuses, as I said, on a subset of the UNECE countries, which is the economies in transition in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. So the discussion or the issues that I will mention will reflect the focus of the study, the regional focus of the study. The COVID-19 pandemic and the associated containment and prevention measures taken demonstrated and confirmed the importance of e-commerce not only as an enabler for economic development and for trade, but as a major contributor to the economic resilience of many businesses worldwide, providing opportunities for these businesses to continue and to maintain their business operations. The pandemic also led to different constraints imposed by physical distancing measures and restrictions on movements. Businesses and consumers had to adapt very rapidly, and worldwide, businesses and consumers moved very fast to digital channels, adapting to new business models and new consumption patterns. Governments worldwide had to react to the need to accelerate this shift, the shift to a digital economy and to an environment that is dominated by digital trade. And this acceleration process, of course, met a series of bottlenecks and challenges. Some of these challenges were shared virtually by all countries around the globe, but many of them had to do with pre-existing structural gaps, including in the transition economies that we are discussing today. These structural gaps, of course, were gaps that hindered the long-term sustainable growth of digital trade in these economies and prevented them from fully harnessing the opportunities of digital trade. These include digital infrastructure and connectivity, logistics frameworks and trade facilitation, payment systems, and others. Digital infrastructure and connectivity, let me just touch upon some of these bottlenecks and challenges in regard to the transition economies in focus here, and then try to present to you what some of the governments did in order to address these gaps and what is the way forward. The internet penetration in Central Asia and the Caucasus is among the lowest worldwide, with the exception of Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. The internet penetration and the digital infrastructure connectivity in the region is pretty low. In terms of logistics and trade facilitation, these are fundamental pillars, as we know, to sustain merchandise e-commerce growth. And they are very important for trade, physical trade, and electronic commerce. And again, here there is a varying degrees of logistic network development and trade facilitation development and compliance with the trade facilitation agreement at the WTO in the region. There is greater compliance with certain aspects of the WTO trade facilitation agreement, especially in regard to cross-border paperless trade in many of the countries in the region, with e-customs declarations, and to a lesser extent with e-payment systems, digital certification, single window, and other measures. According to the UN Global Survey on Digital and Sustainable Trade Facilitation 2019 for the transition economies in the UNECE region, the average implementation of trade facilitation measures ranges from 65 to 73% for the Caucasus and Eastern European sub-region to 60% for the Southeastern European region. The implementation of measures related to cross-border paperless trade remain moderate, in other words. Other aspects of trade facilitation, including implementation of formalities-related measures and risk management, post-clearance audit, pre-arrival clearance, expedited shipment, and other measures, is also quite moderate to low in Central Asia and Eastern European countries in transition. And as we know, these measures are crucial for faster clearance of small packages traded through e-commerce. This is very important for business to consumers development. Implementation of measures related to electronic payments and electronic certification is also very low. Now, despite these challenges, countries and governments in the region tried to adapt and adopted certain initiatives in order to tackle these challenges and these bottlenecks. If we take, for example, the ICT infrastructure and services, there is quite a digital divide in the region, as the recent UNCTAD Business to Consumer Index highlights. But some important developments took place in the region and across the region, in fact, in regard to e-government. This was an area that was advanced in many countries in the region. In Uzbekistan, for example, the Telecom and Public Electronic Services regulatory framework is being updated and upgraded as part of the strategy Digital Uzbekistan 2030. In terms of trade facilitation and logistics, many UNECE transition economies are landlocked countries, which of course accentuates and makes the situation more challenging. But as part of their response to the challenges arising from the COVID-19 pandemic, many economies have increased the usage of digital tools aimed at streamlining processes and documentary requirements at the border, or trade facilitation measures that are digitalized. For example, if we take paperless trade in Azerbaijan, the electronic submission of customs declarations and electronic receipt of some approval documents and permits have been automated on the website of the State Customs Committee of the Republic of Azerbaijan. In Georgia, also processes and trade facilitation measures were accelerated. They harmonized the electronic flow of information among key players in the logistics, shipping, and transport industries by launching the trade facilitation system, which will enable traders, customs brokers, freight forwarders, and other stakeholders to submit information through a single entry point. Kazakhstan deployed the single window portal in 2019, and it was further developed to respond to the pandemic with automation of a number of new customs and logistics services, including automated receival of approximately 60 licenses and approval documents, and also in order to facilitate the operation of authorized economic operators, bonded houses owners, and registries for customs activities. So we can see progress and development in the reaction of governments of transition economies to the pandemic in facilitating trade and improving the logistics infrastructure, in addition to developing the ICT infrastructure and services. Another area of note where development in the reaction of governments took place is in regard to the legal and regulatory framework. Developments also took place in virtually all countries in the region. But of course, important concerns remain to pose a challenge, including in the area of consumer protection. Electronic payment system, this is one of the biggest challenges for the region to enhance the digitalization of trade and improve electronic commerce. Here too, we saw encouraging developments. The Central Bank of the Russian Federation introduced the faster payment system, which is a simplified one-click payment method, and more recently introduced a QR-based function to enable payments of goods and services via mobile devices, and therefore contributing to the expansion of digital payments and improving the cashlessness in the society. Turkey also introduced additional fintech companies launched new products like e-wallets and prepaid card solutions targeting consumers, especially the unbanked population. And this expansion accelerated in the past year. In Georgia, card penetration is increasingly increasing. As of January 2020, there were 6.1 million debit cards and 0.6 million credit cards issued across Georgia's population of 3.7 million people. In the Central Asian countries, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, cash was the main preferred mode of payment. But with the expansion of mobile banking and mobile banking applications and the pandemic, the fintech, as I said earlier, and electronic payments, it grew rapidly. In Kazakhstan, okay, I think I covered this one. Yes, in Kazakhstan, they developed the Kaspi app, which of course nudged the movement towards cashless payments and increased the financial inclusion of various segments of society. So these were some of the challenges that were met or addressed by governments in the region to respond to the acceleration of digitalization and e-commerce in the region in response to the pandemic. But of course, as we know, there are still challenges and issues to consider. And let me maybe, in the interest of time, move to the recommendations for the way forward. And I will be very interested to hear from you, including the audience, on your views on these recommendations and whether you think they're valid for the transition economies. As we move forward, expanding the ICT infrastructure and the ICT services, especially following the outcomes of the UNCTAD Business to Consumer Index, there is a clear need to work on addressing the digital divide in the region to ensure accessible, efficient, and affordable ICT services. Another recommendation is to develop appropriate legal and regulatory frameworks to instill consumer confidence, security in electronic payments, protection of data, privacy, cybersecurity, digital certification, digital signatures, and others. These regulatory frameworks and policy frameworks need to be flexible to accompany the fast evolving technological developments. A third element that's also worth noting and worth taking note of is the importance of regulatory cooperation on not only nationally, but also the regulatory cooperation on a regional and global level to address cross-border trade and pro-competitive behavior. A third recommendation is the need to embrace the use of advanced technologies. The ability to deal with and embrace new technologies and new trends in the e-commerce market, including artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, fintech, has an impact on the way e-commerce is conducted and will have an impact on the development of e-commerce. Fourth, promoting electronic payments and online financial inclusion. With improved consumer confidence as a result of regulatory developments and trust in e-payments, it's important to enable and enhance the ability of consumers to make electronic payments and enhance the digital financial literacy of consumers. Fifth, improving trade facilitation and logistics. Of course, this is very important for trade generally, but also for e-commerce. And it would be very important to accelerate the implementation of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, in addition to international instruments, other international instruments and best practices for the harmonization of the electronic exchange of trade-related information, formalities, and procedures. And here the region might want to continue the work on improving the trade facilitation and logistics network while identifying in the short to medium term, identifying the low-hanging fruits that help in developing e-commerce and help businesses in sustaining the impact of and overcoming the impact of the pandemic. For example, enhancing the adoption of automated customs processes, single windows, paperless cross-border trade, and other measures, while working on the longer-term objectives and measures that are more complex, such as exchanging e-certification of origin or SPS certification and other regulatory cooperation needed to implement certain measures. In the same spirit, addressing the needs of SMEs and MSMEs and women traders is very important, including helping MSMEs and women traders to migrate online and helping them in branding and developing their online portals, provide information to MSMEs and women traders on markets and other information is very important. An aspect that's also important to consider is the need to use international standards and recommendations and guidance to accelerate trade facilitation, in addition to implementing the WTO agreement on trade facilitation. And here, two things come to mind. One is the UN CFACT electronic business standards and the WCO safe framework, in addition to other recommendations and international standards. Another recommendation is to understand and measure the e-commerce and strengthening global and regional cooperation. This is a very important aspect that complements any national efforts to improve the functioning of and the development of e-commerce nationally. I would stop here, and I will be looking forward to the other presentations and to comments from the floor. Thank you.
Many thanks, Hadil, for that very comprehensive presentation. And you started with the challenges, and then you gave us a rundown on very specific measures that countries in the UNECE region are implementing already. And you also highlighted some very concrete recommendations for the way forward in terms of closing digital divide, establishing the right regulatory and legal framework, improving consumers' confidence, harnessing or benefiting from advanced technologies, trade facilitation, and international cooperation. So these are really all mechanisms and tools that you have outlined as recommendations for the way forward. I could also see that in the chat, there are already a host of questions in Russian about the trade, non-trade nature of e-commerce, about the turnover, about some of the specific objectives of to whom regulations or policies should be addressed. So we are getting a whole lot of questions, and I invite our speakers also to look at them. Now, question to you, Vitaly, like Hadil has just mentioned the importance of cooperation and international action and has also referred to WTO. How does the WTO legal framework, the e-commerce work there, come into play when we are looking at e-commerce, and what is happening there in WTO? And here I guess that it's also in parallel a moment to again ask our audience with some Mentimeter questions. So there will be parallel activities happening, but Vitaly, the attention, yeah, exactly. So here we have a Mentimeter question. The main challenges for countries with economies in transition. And as the audience still looks at the challenges, Vitaly, tell us what is happening in WTO and how does this come into play here? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I will certainly try to answer this question and to provide some more general also background about the current negotiations on e-commerce. Great. So during my part of the presentation of this session, we will talk about three main issues: importance of e-commerce in global trade and what this concept means in the WTO, background on the WTO negotiations on e-commerce and the objective, and examples of the negotiated WTO rules on e-commerce and how they relate to the existing WTO rules. Now, my introduction to e-commerce as a WTO subject has started not so long time ago after a meeting with one Geneva-based ambassador who has a much better technical background than me and was at the time very actively involved in WTO negotiations on e-commerce. Now, my personal impression from that meeting was that just a few years ago, many delegates of WTO members understood the concept of e-commerce differently, and they also saw differently the role that the WTO could play in the regulation and facilitation of e-commerce. It is clear that e-commerce is a very broad subject. It, for example, may relate to various business transactions surrounding services such as internet booking, online streaming, or digital marketing. Today, e-commerce is also a very large component of trade and goods. Think, for example, of online shops such as Zalando. I'm not even mentioning 3D printing or many other services that have emerged relatively recently. So those who are familiar with WTO law will already know that the subject of e-commerce seems to be at the crossroads of many already existing areas of WTO law: trade in goods, trade in services, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. And that is why from the very beginning, from 1998, when the WTO program on e-commerce started, this issue was studied by very different WTO bodies, such as the Council for Trade and Services, the Council for Trade and Goods, the Committee for Trade and Development, etc. And the purpose here was really just even to determine what additional disciplines on e-commerce were required in the WTO that already do not exist in this legal framework. Now, the specific definition of the concept of e-commerce that has been adopted and which is now used in the current negotiations on e-commerce is the production, distribution, marketing, sale, or delivery of goods and services by electronic means. Now, note here again that the rules on e-commerce will regulate trade in both goods and services. And this is very significant because there have been some debates among different WTO members on whether different digital products, such as, for example, digital movies or video games, should properly be categorized as goods and services, which are subject to very different WTO rules. So in essence, the new rules on e-commerce should make this debate less important. But despite the fact that the scope of WTO rules on e-commerce was initially unclear, the general importance of this subject has always been understood in the WTO because, of course, of the growing importance of e-commerce in the economy. And I think this was very nicely highlighted by Hadil. There are also some reports that suggest that the value of global data flows have already bypassed the value of trade in goods. Then we also, just based on our personal experience, we could see, for example, that because of the global COVID-19 pandemic, how important for all of us e-commerce has become. This was, for example, also highlighted in various WTO reports on the relationship between e-commerce and the COVID-19 pandemic. Just based on our own life experience, some of the findings in these reports are not are very straightforward and obvious. So, for example, because of the rules on lockdowns, services such as social media use or teleconferencing have become more important. Their consumption has increased, but e-commerce with a strong trade in goods component or e-commerce linked to services such as tourism and transport was adversely affected. Now, I would like to provide a very brief overview of the negotiations on e-commerce in the WTO, how they have started, and what they aim at, and what is their current state as well. Now, the WTO work on e-commerce can be divided into sort of three main blocks, three main periods. The work has started at the 1998 Geneva Ministerial Conference, which entrusted the WTO General Council, which is one of the highest level decision-making bodies in the WTO, with the task of establishing a comprehensive program on e-commerce. And at that conference, members also agreed to maintain their practice not to impose customs duties on electronic transmission. Since that time, this agreement has been upheld in all subsequent WTO ministerial conferences. Now, the work program sets out the mandate of the current negotiations, and it also instructed various technical specialized bodies of the WTO, such as, for example, the Council for Trade in Goods, to examine the relevance of different Kovid agreements to the subject of e-commerce. So from that period of time, the 1998 until even now, many different reports and many different technical notes have been produced on various trade-related aspects of e-commerce. But more recently, the negotiations on e-commerce have been reinvigorated by WTO members since 2019 through a joint statement of a significant number of WTO members in Davos, and also through the decision of the WTO General Council to adhere to the work program on e-commerce and really intensify WTO negotiations on this subject. At the moment, the General Council is expected to report the results of its work of the current negotiations to the 12th Ministerial Conference, which hopefully will take place in Nur Sultan at the end of 2021. Now, this Ministerial Conference has been postponed several times because of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. According to my count, which most recent count, more than 80 members have joined the initiative on e-commerce and actively participate in these negotiations, and approximately 7 rounds of negotiations have been held so far. Now, how are the negotiations conducted, and what exactly is being discussed? The negotiations initially were conducted in 6 focus groups, each of which addressed different trade-related aspects of e-commerce. Then the results of these negotiations in those focus groups, they were consolidated in a single consolidated text. The most recent text that I have seen was of December 2020, which was still a fairly large text, approximately maybe 100 pages. And it still included a lot of squared brackets, which indicates that there are still a lot of disagreements between members on how certain issues relating to e-commerce should be addressed in the WTO. Now, in terms of the specific issues that were covered in these different negotiating groups and are now reflected in the consolidated text, many issues that were discussed in Group A address the questions of how to facilitate e-commerce and electronic administration of trade. So, for example, members agreed to recognize in their domestic systems the UNCITRAL model law on e-commerce. They agreed also to to eliminate the discrimination between the electronic way of doing business and the traditional way of doing business by recognizing, for example, electronic signatures, electronic contracts and invoices in their domestic systems. They're also discussing the introduction of electronic administration of trade and the use of technology for customs clearance. As far as the issues in Group B are concerned, they relate to non-discriminatory treatment of digital products, which include both services and goods, as we discussed earlier. Some other issues are, for example, a limited liability of interactive computer services, such as search engines or hosting companies for example, violation of IP rights or privacy. A very important subject is data flows and data localization requirements. So some members, for example, they prohibit various service suppliers from transferring their data abroad and require those suppliers to establish local servers. And this is done for various regulatory reasons, including to protect consumers, but also, for example, to facilitate taxation in their domestic systems. So this is something that is now covered and addressed in this group. Now, Group C addresses what members have described as trust and e-commerce. So those are issues of online consumer protection and unsolicited commercial electronic messages, among many other issues. Group D addresses questions of transparency, cooperation between members, some general principles of domestic regulation, capacity building, and so on. And finally, Group E addresses some competitive safeguards, some basic principles that would govern telecommunication services, which in turn enable e-commerce and relate to infrastructure, the infrastructure of this trade area. Now, the initiative, which was mainly proposed by the European Union, and it is based on the telecom reference paper, which is a legal instrument, in a nutshell, a plurilateral agreement between certain members that already exists in the WTO legal framework. So overall, just to summarize these issues and to just share my views on what is currently being addressed in the negotiations, members are essentially negotiating a very technical trade facilitation agreement for e-commerce with some minimal standards of the treatment of e-commerce and digital products based on various international standards, including, for example, the UN Central Model Law. These negotiations also aim at removing the existing ambiguities as to whether certain digital products are goods and services by subjecting them to one set of rules. Finally, one of the goals of the negotiations is to turn certain member-specific or plurilateral rules, such as various e-commerce related services commitments, the telecom reference paper, and the information technology agreement, which already exists in the WTO, into a multilateral agreement. So this is, in my view, the key objectives of the negotiations. Now, on the last slide, which I have, I just provided some links where some of the proposals of members and documents relating to e-commerce could be found. As you can see, many of these proposals and documents are still restricted. So if you wish to get some general idea of what is being discussed, you may wish to download some of the proposals of members. But at the moment, it is still difficult to have a comprehensive discussion of these rules because, first, there is still no agreement among all members on what will be included in the final text. And also, many of these agreements are not publicly available. So I'm kind of basing my discussion on what I have seen personally because of my practical work and what is publicly available on the WTO website. Thank you very much. At this point, I would like to conclude, and I look forward to a very interesting discussion in the remaining part of our seminar. Thank you.
Many thanks Vitaly, for that. You've given us a massively comprehensive overview, and you have looked a little bit at the history of work in WTO, the relationship between different work streams, trade facilitation, GATS, and so forth. And you also have touched on some very specific issues, and in that way helped us answer some of the questions in the chat, the classification issues, trade or non-trade issue, personal versus commercial activities in this regard. So thank you for doing that. And when highlighting the issues arising in the 6 focus groups and the group A to D, transparency, competition-related, consumer protection, I think that really pinpoints us to some of the questions about the specific domestic regulatory frameworks that we can also see in the chat. So thank you for that. Vitaly, now, before we turn to our 2 commentators, I think it's time to look quickly at what the audience had to say in terms of main challenges for transition economies. Let's see what our word cloud says here. And just from a visual representation, we can see that infrastructure and digital divide definitely come up as sort of like 2 key challenges that countries, including transition economies, are facing. And but there are many more, and I think some of them very technical, such as currency conversion, some of them also relating to the issues we've already heard in the presentations, like digital connectivity, IP protection, and payments, for example. So thank you for the views of the audience on that. We will make the word clouds available at some point. Now, let me turn to our 2 commentators who have agreed to be with us in today's webinar. And I'm very pleased now to turn the floor to Torbjörn from UNCTAD to talk a little bit to us about also the work of UNCTAD and maybe relate this to some of the things we've heard already in our first 2 presentations.
Thank you, Lizzie. And maybe first I'd like to build on what was said, because sometimes the area of e-commerce is one that sometimes causes a bit of confusion, especially when we talk about the WTO, because the WTO's definition of e-commerce for negotiation purposes is quite broad. Now, if we instead consider how to measure e-commerce, then it's quite carefully defined to mean whatever goods and services that are ordered online. When you place the order online, that generates e-commerce. And of course, that means that general statistics on e-commerce refer to domestic and cross-border e-commerce. So not all e-commerce numbers that you see floating around refer to cross-border trade. In fact, we estimate that only about 10% of the total world business to consumer e-commerce is cross-border. So most e-commerce is still a domestic thing. Now, we have also, together with various international organizations, WTO, OECD, and so on, developed the definition of digital trade. And what that basically means is any goods and services that are ordered online, which is what I said was e-commerce, and any products delivered digitally. So these 2 components now, from a measurement perspective, would characterize digital trade. And maybe just in view of the last presentation here on the WTO's work in this area, e-commerce started already in 1998. And if we then fast forward to today's time and think just as an illustration of what a different world we're living in right now, in the beginning of 2000 of the 21st century, we saw data flows of about 100 gigabytes per second in 2002. Today, we're seeing 100,000 gigabytes per second as data flows. So we are in a very, very different landscape now when it comes to digital economy. Let me now go back to the broader perspective here and connect with the discussion here on the link between COVID and the pandemic, between COVID and e-commerce. So it's clear that the pandemic has dealt a hard blow to broader efforts to achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Just as an illustration, UNCTAD predicts that the global economy shrank last year by more than 4%. So we have been set back a lot in terms of our efforts to eradicate poverty and so on. And as has been stressed already, while restrictions on movement and other interventions to protect public health reduced economic activity across sectors and countries, we also witnessed a strong uptake in digitally enabled activities. You could say that digitalization has partially mitigated the economic downturn caused by the pandemic, paving the way for lasting changes in work, entertainment, leisure, and consumption patterns. And if I can build a little bit on the global review of the impact of COVID on e-commerce that we have, that has been referred to by several speakers already, and we will be releasing the full report on the 12th of March, which is just around the corner. We saw, for instance, that 58% of consumers surveyed by UNCTAD spent more time on entertainment sites during the pandemic. Just an example, Netflix added 26 million new subscribers just in the first 2 quarters of 2020. In terms of online gaming, sales across 50 major markets rose by more than 60% during the first quarter of 2020. The online share of retail sales increased in all sectors, but particularly in the case of pharmaceutical and health goods, groceries, electronic and ICT goods. Take the case of Amazon, the online retailer and cloud service provider. It had its most profitable quarter ever in the third quarter of 2020. And we have also seen in other parts of the world, in Latin America and Africa, the online e-commerce players have seen their sales surge very, very much. And the number of merchants that are using these kind of online marketplaces, entering these marketplaces, has increased significantly. So e-commerce and digital trade have played an important role in maintaining economic activity during the pandemic, and the shifts that are taking place now are likely to have long-term effects also when we start going back to a new normal. We have seen that many smaller businesses have been able to keep their operations running or even expanding them by enhancing their online offerings. But the ones that have been most successful here are the ones that were already quite active online, because the ability to go digital still varies a lot. There are huge digital divides, and they mean that further digital shifts may result in even greater divides and even greater inequalities between different countries and between players within countries. Just to cite a few numbers from the B2C e-commerce index that we have referred to, while over 80% of the population in the United Kingdom, in Switzerland, and in the Nordic countries already shop online, the corresponding shares in Belarus and Russia, for instance, are about 30%. And if you look at most developing countries, the share is below 10%. In fact, this applies also to G20 countries like India, Indonesia, and South Africa. In many countries, capitalizing on e-commerce has been hampered by disruptions in supply chains and trade logistics, costly broadband services, reliance still on cash, difficulties for reskilling, etc. And some business respondents to our work have stressed that there hasn't been enough attention to e-commerce by governments. Meanwhile, the pandemic has primarily benefited the world's leading digital platforms. You know, most of the digital solutions that we and everyone around the world are using right now are provided by a relatively small number of very large companies based mainly in China and the United States. And the increased market power of this handful of players has also fueled some concerns about the distribution of the value created in the digital economy, as well as about consumer protection and fair competition. So, what role then for digital trade in the post-pandemic agenda? Well, we see a need for greater efforts in 3 critical areas in order to leverage the potential benefits of e-commerce and digital trade, particularly in the context of the post-pandemic efforts. First, governments need to harness and address holistically their national digital readiness in order for local businesses to be able to fully participate and compete in the evolving landscape. Countries that develop relevant policies and programs will be better placed to leverage the benefits and to build back better from the pandemic. A good starting point in many cases is to develop a national e-commerce or a national digital economy strategy as a roadmap for a better and sustainable digital future, which really brings the different stakeholders together. Secondly, businesses in developing countries need to become better equipped for the digital economy. This will require accelerated digitalization of smaller businesses, more attention to digital entrepreneurship and innovation, improved capabilities to harness digital data and platforms, and stronger regulatory frameworks to promote value creation and capture. Thirdly, the international community, including development partners, the UN and other agencies, need to find smarter ways to work together and with the private sector to leverage opportunities and minimize the risk of countries falling by the wayside. We think the COVID-19 crisis has accentuated the need for smarter integrated approaches at national and regional levels and stronger global platforms for dialogue when it comes to digitalization. We hope that UNCTAD and our partners in the E-Trade for All initiative, including the UNECE, can continue to play our part by calling for a stronger collective response on the road to recovery. Somehow we need to look for ways to turning this greatest challenge of our time into an opportunity to create a more digital, but more inclusive also, and more sustainable future for all. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Torbjörn, for your comments on the topic at issue. And you have nicely also started with some of the definitional issues that are important to bear in mind when we look at the numbers and measurements. And you've given us some impressive numbers in terms of increase of data flow. And Torbjörn, from the UNCTAD perspective, you really also zoomed into the digital divide between countries, sort of the share of online shopping, which is very different depending on whether it's developed, transition, or developing economies, and also the sort of like digital divide in terms of the companies, who is actually benefiting from these e-commerce opportunities. Now, by giving us some recommendations for the way forward, I think you have also nicely answered some of the questions we've had in the chat, where we were asked to come up with some very concrete recommendations. And I hope that the UNCTAD study will sort of like further shed light on that. And you've also nicely mentioned at the end the importance of making a collective effort for the different organizations and development players in this regard. So very comprehensive, and thank you for that. Let us now briefly see, there was one last Mentimeter question that we would have liked to engage with the audience, and that relates precisely to this way forward and what are now possible entry points for the way forward. And here we have grouped already a little bit the options for responding, and what we see here is that indeed regional cooperation is seen as one of the key entry points. That's the red bar here. Trade facilitation is also seen as one of the key entry points, and followed thirdly by work in the WTO negotiations on e-commerce. So here are some of the responses from our audience. Obviously, national work also matters, and not to forget the inclusivity approach on the SME and gender side. And to that also relate all these work streams related to inclusivity and sustainability as part of the COVID-19 response. So having had a glimpse of what our audience thinks in terms of like, what's the way forward, what are possible ways to address the challenges, let me now turn to our second commentator. Let me turn to an expert from an economy in transition. Let me turn to Mr. Medvedkov from the Russian Federation to shed light on how this all plays out in your specific context.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I may confirm, as a village 8 kilometers from Moscow, that during a year, as a consumer of electronic services, I have changed both my appetite and my requirements substantially. I have not seen during that 1 year banknotes because told in our village that you should avoid taking banknotes in your hand because you may catch this COVID. And that's why next day our shop in the village has closed, has not accepted more the banknote operated through mobile phones, and respectively banks have in your mobile phones special programs. You don't need more credit cards. All payments you may do physically without credit cards, without banknotes, just through that programs. And I may continue that story caused by COVID, basically. And those things which we thought are fantastic 1 year ago, now everybody believes it's part of normal life. And it should continue because it's safe and because consumers are happy, producers are happy as well. And the figures which we see in Russia in respect of, for example, e-commerce turnover increased last year by about 60%. And this year, 2021, there are expectations that we will increase by another 20% at a minimum. So this business is booming. And the major problem which we have with that business currently is that we do not understand what e-commerce means. And I totally join our distinguished speakers in their questions that we probably need as a priority to agree between ourselves what we mean under e-commerce, what we mean under digital trade, because otherwise we will even not be able to explain those growth rate of 58% of e-commerce. What does it mean? In Russian case, what these figures mean? They mean increase of trade through internet of only goods like electronics, like shoes, furniture, foodstuffs, but these figures are not covering trade and service. And I called yesterday to aggregator of that data, biggest Russian association of internet traders. They said, look, we don't know, what banks are doing, we don't know what telecoms are doing, so you have to address them. So I've seen a text of a draft agreement on e-commerce. It's on internet, by the way. Again, I can only confirm that there is, even in that text, no clear definition of what our colleagues are negotiating about. So my proposal would be to address this as this definition, or at least explanation what it's about, as a matter of absolute priority. Second issue, which are of concern, of potential concern, is right of the government to regulate and borders or limits for such possible regulation. Russia is currently in a rather specific situation. We do not have a lot of laws specifically addressing issue of e-commerce, because again, we don't know what e-commerce means. And businesses are developing subject to old standard laws like civil code, for example. The specific features of current e-commerce business certainly are not taken into account. I don't know whether it's good or bad, but certainly at some point, people are speaking, people are to start to speak about strengthening digital totalitarianism. What does it mean that companies, that big banks, for example, in Russia, or big internet providers, as they offer more and more internet-based services, they create a kind of ecosystem when you as a consumer may choose between hundreds of different service providers in one place. And so these companies are dictating to consumer, in fact, what to buy and where. Again, I'm thinking good or bad. I'm questioning whether countries will have the right to regulate this kind of activity if they wish so. And unfortunately, I have not received an answer on what negotiators in Geneva are thinking about that, and where will be the limits of that regulation. The recent information which was on internet a couple of days ago was about proposal of United States in respect of responsibility of those companies who provide infrastructure for e-commerce. And the idea is that they should be free from responsibility in respect of quality of those electronic signals or those services which will be delivered by them to final consumers. And now we have a question in terms of all that regulatory framework, whether we still should keep in mind approaches which we still are using under the GET and the GETS. For example, in customs, we means WTO members. We may request a company to either establish in Russia or in other WTO member in order to have the right to clear the product. Or you may hire an agent which will take all your responsibilities. We have a similar approach in services. So you may not provide some types of cross-border services without kind of establishment. For example, financial services in most of the countries, that's a rule. However, I don't know how negotiators in WTO will approach this issue, whether this kind of regulatory requirement will continue to be a part of instruments for the government, or like some members, at least what we see in the press, believe there should be this kind of a requirement should be avoided and limited to only a very specific sectors, like financial services. So it's our second request or second concern in respect of this possible right to regulate. And I think that there are many countries in the region which are still thinking about what to do with that, how to do with that, and if the world community will not give the answer, they will do whatever they believe is the best. And after, if they do it, it will be much more difficult probably to establish common rules for everybody, because the system will develop in a different directions, which we also already see, for example, in respect of e-commerce, some e-commerce policies in the US and in the European Union. And finally, my question or remark is whether the future agreement in WTO on e-commerce, whatever it will be, should have so many best endeavor clauses as compared with get or gets, which are traditionally documents which impose on your commitment rather than advice that probably you should do so that which cannot be subject to a dispute settlement to enforcement. I totally understand that in many instances and in many to avoid commitment, and traders are using, for example, in negotiations on trade facilitation agreement, this approach of best endeavor clauses as a kind of a second best approach. But we should, I think, at least try to check whether we may ask our governments to decide on something which will really establish a rule for the game, recommendations for that rules. We are currently discussing a topic which will be economically and also politically very much important in the next 5-10 years. And probably it would be a much more successful story if the story will develop on the basis of rules rather than on the basis of expectations. That's what I wanted to convey from near Moscow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fedetkov. Thank you, Maxim, for that. And you also pointed out this big definitional challenge we are having. Like, if we don't have the common understanding, how can we measure, how can we have a proper conversation about what are we actually talking about in terms of e-commerce, and be it goods or be it services, the follow-up questions there. Maxim, you also pointed out one issue that is very close to my heart, and I think too much of the work we are doing on development questions, which is the right to regulate. And how do we deal with the right to regulate, particularly in countries where the regulatory framework on a specific issue is still emerging and is maybe not yet as comprehensive. And we do realize that when it comes to e-commerce, questions such as consumer protection or competition are indeed very, very important. And you also gave the example of whether or not to request an establishment of a company under certain cases. So I think this how to preserve the right to regulate while at the same time ensuring clear rules is definitely one of the key questions. And that also brings us a little bit to the nature of the agreement. Are we looking towards the best endeavor or towards the fully legally binding type of framework? So all of that very relevant and great questions to our negotiators here in Geneva. Now, to close, we have a tiny bit of time left, and having gone through the many questions we had in the chat, let me maybe pose one to all of our speakers, a broad one, and that really brings it all back to the development dimension and the challenges countries are facing when they are not yet sort of like fully engaged on the best ways for harnessing the benefits of e-commerce for development. What's really sort of the takeaway? Like, what is the policy recommendation you would choose that we need to focus on? And we've heard a lot of them, but give us the glimpse of one if you wish to. Let's see whether I can play that to our speakers. Maybe we start with, shall we go the order as we did before? Hadil, you've given us a whole range of policy options. Pick one that we should keep in our mind as we close this session.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I don't think that one can pick one because e-commerce straddles different areas that range from infrastructure to regulatory developments. So I would resist the temptation to pick up one. And I would say that it's very important to e-commerce has the COVID pandemic has shown us the importance of e-commerce as a catalyst for economic development and as a key factor in the economic resilience. But we need to make sure that the small and medium businesses do not fall between the cracks. And as we have heard from UNCTAD, the bigger players, of course, benefited most from the e-commerce during the pandemic. And I think we all have a responsibility to discuss and reflect on what can be done and what should be done in order to encourage small and medium businesses and SMEs, and including women traders, to benefit from the opportunities that e-commerce provides, especially in developing countries and economies in transition. Small and medium businesses are the bulk of the economy. And if we leave them by the sideways, we cannot talk about economic resilience and economic recovery.
Thank you, Hadil. And I'm sure that the study will give us a lot of meat also on that. And indeed, this inclusivity aspect is key, I think, to all of the international organizations working on development. Let me turn for a quick remark on priorities or recommendations to Vitali, or anything you wish to add to the debate.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I cannot give any policy recommendations because the CWL has no mandate on that, but I can just share one question that we hear very often. That is on the relationship between these negotiations and the digital divide. For example, how the negotiations could really promote development and what they will give to the developing countries, for example, and the economies in transition. And I just would like to point out that, like any WTO rules, this agreement will not create the infrastructure. It just itself will not create the infrastructure in any countries, or, for example, bring new foreign direct investment or even foreign aid. All WTO rules, they just create transparent frameworks, market access opportunities. They sort of set minimum standards of treatment of goods, services, potentially even investors. And then it is, of course, once all these rules are implemented by different countries, then all those problems can be solved. And I think it is very important to understand that what is really being negotiated now is just sort of a common understanding on what those transparent and open market conditions will be for all WTO members.
Thank you, Vitali. And also you brought it to this sort of inclusivity development aspect that we really need to care about. And you also reminded us to calibrate our expectations of what international rules, in this case, e-commerce rules, can deliver and what they maybe cannot deliver. Now, let me give our two commentators also the opportunity for a brief concluding remark. Torbjörn.
Yes, thank you. So thanks first for an interesting webinar. It's been very interesting. I think most importantly, it's important for all countries to recognize that e-commerce is not going to go away in any way. Mm-hmm. And it is very disruptive. It changes the way we do things and the way we interact and consume, how we produce, how we deliver. So the most important message I would have to member states and stakeholders that are helping governments in this area is really to take this seriously and really dig into the material and figure out what needs to be done in my own country. And if we as the international community can help in this process, we are available. I think first, for many of the developing and transition economies, there is a lot of homework to be done at the national level, whether or not there is successful outcomes in the WTO. Where a number of countries have not entered into any free trade agreements with e-commerce clauses yet. This is particularly the case in Africa, but many other parts of the world as well. So there is a learning process right now in so many different dimensions. And if we can work together to share experiences and also discuss in the dialogue with all the stakeholders across countries, I think a lot of time can be won. And as I said, through the e-trade fraud, through our collaboration in the EU and so on, we are ready to help in that context.
Thank you, Torbjörn, for flagging once again the magnitude of the challenge, that it's not going to solve itself. So we really need to look into this also very much at the national level, and international community stands ready to assist. Now, Maxime, turning back to Moscow, the one concluding remark, takeaway message or recommendation.
I think I fully support what Mr. Fredriksson has done.
Now something happened with the muting.
Sorry, yeah.
Good.
I fully support what Mr. Fredriksson has said, with one additional remark. We should deal this matter with a sense of urgency. Mm-hmm. No, I mean that some negotiations are easy, others are not. That negotiations on e-commerce are difficult, but we know that difficult negotiations on agriculture, which we have had in WTO the last 40 years, and they are still going on, and nobody knows how they will and when they will conclude. So I think mankind should decide to bring all intellectual forces in Geneva, or probably they may stay at home and communicate electronically, in order to do this really quickly, because otherwise rules will be created by the market, by the companies themselves, and we will be retired. That's my forecast.
Thank you, Maxime, for that, and highlighting the urgency. Indeed, there is something happening, and one needs to shape it and needs to get engaged. So thank you to all the speakers. I think we've had a really rich discussion covering so many very different dimensions and aspects, and sort of just touching on some of the very intricate technical details. And we all see now that that's a very complex issue, and that already by sharing experiences and having that discussion we have today, that hopefully we could improve the situation a little bit and shed a little bit of light on some of the complexities. So I'm very happy that as UNECE and together with the Geneva Trade Platform, we could host this event, and I look forward that UNECE will also contribute with its specific areas of expertise, be it in the area of trade facilitation or of regional integration, our support to SPECA, the special program for the economies in Central Asia, that we can continue engaging and supporting our joint endeavors here. Now, it's been lovely to be with everybody, and I thank once again all our amazing speakers, the organizations for making the time available. Thank you to UNCTAD, ACWL, WTI Advisors, and the Higher School of Economics. And thank you also to the speakers for their presentations. And last but not least, also a big thank you to the team, all of those who have worked so hard to make today's event happen. And that includes our partners at the Geneva Trade Platform, particularly Dimitri, Ionita, and Michael. And that also includes the UNECE team, Nadia, Mariam, and Salehin. So we've all together made today's event a success. And I think now it's also for us to continue working together in terms of embarking on all these important challenges. And thank you to our audience for being with us and for engaging. And we look forward to taking this further. I wish you all a wonderful day.